The night Lydia Carrington died, London was wrapped in fog. A shadow was seen outside her house. Then another. Then another. 3 witnesses. 3 different men. But Miss Marple knew something strange about shadows. They change shape when someone moves the light.
Welcome to the Hidden Library. Tonight's entry begins on Sloane Street, where rumors of a prowler circulate through the fog, and days later, a respected widow is found dead in her drawing room. If you enjoy thoughtful mysteries, like and subscribe to support the Hidden Library, and share in the comments where you're listening from as we begin. Now, turn the page and step into the shadow over Sloane Street. Chapter 1. A Niece of London. The number 17 bus, Miss Marple had always maintained, told you everything worth knowing about the human race. She had reached this conclusion not through any great philosophy, but through 35 years of observation from the upper deck of various conveyances, supplemented by the kind of quiet watching that people in villages do as a matter of course, and people in cities forget entirely. She was not, on the whole, a great admirer of London. The air tasted of soot and something else, a mineral quality she associated with ambition, which she distrusted mildly. But Raymond had insisted, and Raymond, when he set his mind to something, became tiresome in the specific way that intelligent men become tiresome. He accumulated reasons. "You haven't been up since February. And Aunt Jane, Joyce has been asking for you, and you've said yourself that Dr. Haydock wants you to rest. What better rest than doing absolutely nothing in Chelsea?" Miss Marple had pointed out gently that doing absolutely nothing was rather more difficult in Chelsea than in St. Mary Mead, where one at least had the garden. Raymond had not been persuaded by this, and so here she was. Raymond's flat occupied the 2nd floor of a narrow Georgian building in Cheyne Walk, overlooking the Embankment. It was the sort of flat that announced on entering that its owner was a writer of serious reputation. Good rugs, indifferent lighting, bookshelves covering every wall, and here and there a piece of African sculpture that Miss Marple privately felt would give her nightmares. Joyce West was a pleasant young woman of the modern sort. Capable, good-humored, and with a disconcerting habit of meaning exactly what she said. She had welcomed Miss Marple with genuine warmth and installed her in the best bedroom, where the window looked out over the river and the curtains were a very respectable shade of blue. At breakfast on the 2nd morning, Raymond lowered his newspaper with the expression of a man about to be interesting. "There is a piece here about your friend Mrs. Carrington." "Lydia." Miss Marple looked up from her boiled egg. "What has she done?" "Opened something, apparently. A reading room for working women in Pimlico. The paper makes it sound rather noble." He read aloud in the tone he used for prose he considered inflated. "Mrs. Carrington, whose generosity to various charitable causes has long distinguished her in London society, presided yesterday at the opening ceremony." He folded the paper. "She sounds formidable." "She's not in the least formidable," said Miss Marple. "She is, in fact, very kind, though I have not seen her since the Wentworth business. Oh, that must be 4 years ago now. She and her husband were living in Oxfordshire at the time. He died shortly afterwards." "And left her everything, I assume?" "Raymond," said Joyce, without looking up from her own newspaper. "Well, did he?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that she was left comfortably provided for. Yes. She moved to London. Sloane Street, I think. One of those very pleasant, narrow houses near the gardens." She paused, the spoon resting in her egg cup. "I ought to call on her." Raymond appeared to consider this. "Shall I come?" "No, dear. and I think Lydia would find that rather alarming. She is not quite accustomed to novelists. Sloane Street on a Tuesday morning wore the composed expression of a place that has been fashionable long enough not to require reassurance. The houses stood in a particular way, shoulders back, brass knockers gleaming, that reminded Miss Marple of certain women she had known in the village who dressed very well and made sure everyone was aware of it. Number 42 had window boxes filled with late autumn violas, purple and yellow and white, quite immaculately kept. The step was freshly whitened. Miss Marple approved. A house that attended to its window boxes and its step told you something about its occupant, or at the very least, about the standard of its servants. The door was opened by a housemaid, young and neat, who took Miss Marple's card with the slightly wary expression of a girl not entirely certain how to classify an elderly visitor in a tweed coat who arrived without a prior arrangement. "If you would wait, ma'am, I'll inquire." The entrance hall was well-proportioned and cool. A half-moon table held a silver dish for cards and a small vase of chrysanthemums. On the floor near the staircase foot, someone had set a leather briefcase, rather battered, rather full, with a monogram in gilt that had mostly worn away. It struck an incongruous note, like a muddy boot in a drawing room. Mrs. Carrington came down the stairs with the unhurried grace of a woman who has never needed to hurry for anything. She was 60, perhaps a little more, with white hair dressed beautifully and the kind of regular features that age without deforming. Now she wore black. Not mourning black, but the purposeful black of a woman who has discovered it suits her. "My dear Miss Marple." She took both hands. "What a very pleasant surprise. I did not know you were in London." "Raymond insisted upon it," said Miss Marple, with her vaguest smile. "He is writing something, which means that one is underfoot constantly unless one goes out. I hope I have not called at an awkward moment." "Not at all. Come and have coffee." The drawing-room was at the back of the house, a long, pale room with French windows giving on to a small garden. The garden itself was neat but thin, as London gardens tend to be, and a stone wall at its end was darkened with damp. The room had the quality of having been arranged once and not disturbed since. Good furniture, good pictures, and a Persian carpet that had faded to the color of old roses. On the writing desk near the window, papers were spread in tidy stacks. Miss Marple did not look at them directly. She looked at the chrysanthemums on the mantelpiece, which needed water, and at the garden beyond the French windows, which was neat but thin, as London gardens tend to be, a place maintained rather than loved. "You look well," said Mrs. Carrington, pouring coffee. "St. Mary Mead agrees with you, as always." "It is very quiet just now," said Miss Marple, "though there was a most curious incident last week involving the new people at Jasmine Cottage and a set of garden shares. But I won't trouble you with that. Tell me about your work." Raymond showed me the piece in the newspaper, the reading room in Pimlico. Something moved behind Mrs. Carrington's eyes, brief, like the shadow a cloud makes passing over still water. Then she smiled. "Yes, it has been a great deal of work, but worth it, I think. We have had 40 members enrolled in the first fortnight." She set down the coffee pot. "The administrative side has been, well, there have been 1 or 2 difficulties." She said no more on the subject, and Miss Marple did not press. She noted instead the position of the papers on the desk, one sheet lying at an angle to the others, as though it had been replaced in haste, and the faint crease between Mrs. Carrington's brows that had not been there during their meeting in Oxfordshire. Footsteps crossed the hall outside, quick and decided. A door closed, and Mrs. Carrington's head turned, just slightly, just for a moment, towards the sound. "My stepson is staying for a few days," she said. "How very nice," said Miss Marple. "Yes," said Mrs. Carrington. There was a fraction of a pause between her 2 words and the word that followed, a pause so brief that a less attentive listener would have missed it entirely. Miss Marple filed it away alongside the briefcase in the hall and the papers on the desk replaced in haste, and settled back to 20 minutes of comfortable conversation about Oxfordshire acquaintances and Raymond's latest novel, which she had not read and Mrs. Carrington had not read, and on this comfortable common ground they parted very warmly. Outside on the pavement, Miss Marple drew on her gloves and considered the violas in the window box. They were doing well, now all except one at the right-hand end, which had been planted at the wrong angle for the light. It reached, quite desperately, away from the house wall. Given another week or two, it would give up the effort altogether. She thought, walking slowly toward the bus stop, of a young man she had known once in St. Mary Mead. A nephew visiting his aunt, very charming, very attentive, and quite spectacularly dishonest in small financial matters. Everyone had been terribly surprised. Miss Marple had not been surprised in the least. There had been a way he had of entering a room a moment after his name was mentioned that told you, if you were paying attention, that he had been listening at the door. The footsteps in the hall had stopped precisely when Mrs. Carrington said, "My stepson is staying." Miss Marple found the bus stop. Ton number 17 appeared at the far end of the street, grinding through the mid-morning traffic. She waited for it with the patient, still quality of a woman who has learned that most things, given sufficient time, will come towards you of their own accord. Chapter 2. Those Who Come and Go. Miss Marple returned to Sloane Street 2 days later, on the pretext of returning a book she had borrowed. A small volume of Oxfordshire sketches that Mrs. Carrington had pressed upon her during the first visit, and that Miss Marple had read with genuine interest, though she would have returned it regardless. The morning was bright, with the cold, unreliable brightness of a London October, all clarity and no warmth. Leaves from the plane trees collected in the gutters. A pair of pigeons on the opposite roof appeared to be having a disagreement. The housemaid, Ellen, Miss Marple noted from the embroidered initial on her apron, opened the door and admitted her with rather more confidence than the first occasion. Miss Marple had that effect on domestic staff. She wore the right sort of coat. She wiped her feet properly, and she did not look about her in that assessing way that made servants uneasy. "Mrs. Carrington is in the morning room, ma'am, if you'll wait." The morning room was smaller than the drawing room, east-facing, and still held the previous evening's slight chill. An embroidery frame stood near the window, the work on it barely begun. A rose design in pale thread, the first few stitches oddly uneven for a woman of Mrs. Carrington's neat habits. A copy of the Times lay folded on the side table, open to the personal announcements and not the news. Beside it, a glass of water and a small brown bottle, the label turned towards the wall. Miss Marple sat down without examining either, and took her knitting from her bag. Mrs. Carrington arrived with the brisk step of a woman who has been interrupted in the middle of something. She was cordial, she was warm, and she had, Miss Marple noticed, redressed her hair since morning, which suggested that the interruption was not entirely unwelcome. "How very kind. You needn't have troubled, though. I meant you to keep it." "Oh, I never could. My nephew's flat is already rather buried in books." Miss Marple settled back. "You have more color today, Lydia. The last time I called you seemed, forgive me, rather tired." One is always tired in October. Mrs. Carrington sat and took up her own sewing, a small habitual gesture, like a person picking up armor. "The charity committee has been taxing. There are always 2 or 3 members who equate enthusiasm with interference. The very same difficulty with our Women's Institute. Mrs. Price, perhaps you never met her, would insist on reorganizing the preserves competition every year, and the committee spent more time on procedure than on jam." Miss Marple paused. "Is the difficulty with Mrs. Lowe, by any chance? Raymond mentioned her name in connection with yours." Something cooled, barely perceptibly, in Mrs. Carrington's expression. "Beatrice Lowe. Yes. She and I have differing views on how the Foundation's funds should be directed. She favors rather more public events. I believe the money should go directly to the work. She set a stitch, but we shall resolve it. I am sure you will, said Miss Marple. The front door knocker sounded once, firmly. Ellen's footsteps crossed the hall. Voices exchanged a few words, and then the morning-room door opened, and a man entered with the ease of someone who has never required announcing. He was perhaps 65, with close-cropped grey hair and the squared-off posture of a military man in civilian clothes, the kind of bearing that lingered decades after the uniform was gone. His face was pleasant, his eyes sharp and evaluating, and he produced a smile that had been employed on many occasions and had not lost its effectiveness through overuse. "Lydia, I won't interrupt. I only wanted to drop off the Chamber's report." He held up a manila envelope and then noticed Miss Marple. The smile adjusted itself to suit a wider audience. "I beg your pardon. Hugh Brent, I had no idea you had a visitor." "Miss Marple is an old friend," said Mrs. Carrington. "She's staying with Raymond West in Chelsea. Colonel Brent is a very long-standing family friend." "Charming," said the Colonel. He placed the envelope on the side table with the particular care of a man performing a modest service conspicuously, then took the chair nearest Mrs. Carrington's without waiting to be asked. "I shan't stay. Has the business with the accounts been settled?" "Not yet." Mrs. Carrington's voice held the quality of a door being quietly but firmly shut. Only Halliday mentioned, "It will be settled." The door, this time, had a lock on it. Colonel Brent looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a man changing his conversational terrain with military efficiency. "Are you long in London, Miss Marple?" "A week or two only. I find it rather loud," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Though very interesting, one does observe such a variety of people." "Quite so," said the Colonel. He crossed one leg over the other. He was, Miss Marple thought, a man entirely accustomed to waiting. The kind of patient that is not quite patience, but its better-dressed cousin. He stayed 25 minutes, spoke of several things, and his eyes returned to Mrs. Carrington every time she spoke. The second interruption arrived as Colonel Brent was taking his leave. Miss Marple heard voices in the hall, one of them Brent's with a new and somewhat flatter tone, and then footsteps, and then Dr. Stephen Halliday came in. He was younger than she had expected, mid-40s with a rather handsome face that would have been improved by a little more character and a little less confidence. He carried his medical bag with the air of a man who found it a useful social accessory. "Mrs. Carrington, I won't intrude. I've left a note with Ellen about the prescription." He glanced at Miss Marple with polite and essentially superficial interest. "Your heart has been quite satisfactory, I'm glad to say. You're not to let the committee business excite you." "I am not in the least excited," said Mrs. Carrington. "No, of course not." He smiled as though she had confirmed his professional opinion. "I hope you'll take the tonic as directed. Once in the morning, once in the evening. Consistency is important." "Dr. Halliday," said Miss Marple, with the diffident air of a woman who knows she's transgressing but cannot quite help herself. "I wonder, I have been having a little trouble with my own heart. Nothing serious, but my doctor in St. Mary Mead did mention that one ought to be careful about—" "Oh, what was the term he used? Interactions with other tonics. Is that something Mrs. Carrington need worry about?" Halliday turned his full attention on her for the first time. Attention was not, Miss Marple felt, entirely his natural mode. "Are you asking about contraindications?" "I don't know the technical word. I simply mean, with other remedies she might take. One does accumulate little bottles." "Mrs. Carrington takes nothing else," he said. "Her health is excellent. I've told her repeatedly that she is perfectly sound." He said it with a slight emphasis, as though he had told her this against some resistance. "The tonic is a precaution, nothing more." "How reassuring," said Miss Marple, and returned to her knitting. He left shortly afterwards. Mrs. Carrington saw him to the door herself, and Miss Marple sat for a moment in the empty room and looked at the bottle on the side table. It stood an inch from the folded newspaper, label turned to the wall, She did not touch it. She noted it was there and returned her gaze to her knitting before Mrs. Carrington came back. They had tea. It was brought by Ellen with a composed efficiency that spoke well of her training. Miss Marple praised the shortbread and asked, in the mildest possible way, whether managing a London household was very different from the country. "Oh, yes, ma'am," said Ellen, with the involuntary frankness of a girl addressed as an authority for the first time. "You can't know everyone here, if you take my meaning. In the country, you'd know everyone's business, wouldn't you? Here, people come and go, and you don't always know who's who." "Mr. Adrian visits often?" said Miss Marple. A small hesitation. "When it suits him, ma'am." Mrs. Carrington had not yet returned from the hallway. Miss Marple looked at Ellen with the particular expression she reserved for people who had said something more interesting than they knew. "He seems a pleasant young man," said Miss Marple. "Yes, ma'am," said Ellen, and picked up the empty tray with the careful blankness of a girl who had decided she had already said quite enough. Miss Marple made her farewells at 4:30. On the doorstep she paused, as though something had just occurred to her. "The young man I glimpsed in the hall when I called the other day, that was Mr. Adrian Carrington, was it?" "Yes," said Mrs. Carrington. Something passed through her face, too complex and too brief for a name. "He had some papers for me to look over." "Of course," said Miss Marple. She put on her gloves. "It is such a comfort, isn't it, to have family close by?" Mrs. Carrington agreed that it was. Miss Marple walked back towards the bus stop and thought about medicines and papers and men who arrived bearing envelopes and stayed 25 minutes without quite being invited. She thought about the warmth with which Colonel Brent looked at Lydia Carrington and the manner in which she did not look back. And she thought about what Ellen had said. "You don't always know who's who," which was the plain truth stated as a complaint, but might equally be stated as a warning. The plane trees dropped their leaves with a brisk, indifferent efficiency. The afternoon was drawing in fast, the sky behind the rooftops the color of pewter. Somewhere in the direction of the river, a fog was forming. Miss Marple boarded the bus, settled by the window, and unfolded her knitting with the tranquil air of a woman who had learned that the most useful thing one can do, in the interval between noticing something and understanding it, is to keep one's hands occupied and one's expression serene. Chapter 3. Fog and Whispers. The fog came in from the Thames late on a Thursday evening, and by 9 o'clock it had settled over Chelsea with the comfortable permanence of an uninvited guest who has found the armchair acceptable. Raymond West stood at the drawing-room window, peering into a yellow-grey nothing. The gas lamps in the street below had become pale smears. The embankment, ordinarily visible from this angle, had ceased to exist. He turned back to the room with the expression of a man who finds atmospherics useful in prose and inconvenient in practice. "You won't go out in this, Aunt Jane," he said. It was not quite a command, not quite a request, the tone that falls between the two, which Miss Marple had known him to employ since he was 11 years old. "I'd not intended to go out," said Miss Marple, drawing her shawl a little more snugly and considering the row she was on. "I'm perfectly content, though I will say the fog does remind me of something rather curious that happened once in St. Mary Mead. The winter Mr. Hodgkin's garden shed was broken into." Raymond sat down. He recognized the particular quality of her opening sentences. Slight, rambling, apparently purposeless, and best attended to. "Someone broke into it?" said Joyce from across the room, not looking up from her book. Someone did. And the thing was, nearly everyone in the village had seen a stranger lurking about that week. Mrs. Weatherby saw a tall man in a dark coat by the post office. Old Mr. Simpkins thought he'd seen someone short and slight cutting through the churchyard. The Hartley girl, you know the type, very observant but prone to drama, was quite certain the man had been heavyset and wearing a cap. Miss Marple paused. It transpired that 3 quite different people had passed through the village that week on entirely innocent business. The confusion meant that nobody noticed the one person who was not innocent at all. "And who was that?" said Joyce, looking up now. "A nephew," said Miss Marple. She returned to her knitting. Visiting from Dorchester, it is always instructive when several people have seen something but cannot agree on what. Raymond looked at his aunt. "You're thinking about this business in Sloane Street," he said. "What business?" Joyce put down her book entirely. Raymond settled back into his chair. "Fog gossip, mostly. Jenkins at the Reform mentioned it. His wife knows someone on the street. Apparently several residents have seen a prowler this past week, lurking, apparently, in the vicinity of one of the houses. The police have made a note of it." He glanced towards his aunt, Mrs. Carrington's house, as it happens. Miss Marple's needles paused for the smallest fraction of a second, then continued their quiet work. "What do the neighbors say?" she asked. "That's rather the point. They don't say the same thing at all." Raymond tapped his cigarette against the ashtray. "The fellow's woman from number 40. She says the figure was tall and wore a long, dark overcoat. The tobacconist's boy, who makes deliveries in the evening, says he saw a man in a mackintosh, not particularly tall. And the constable on the beat says there was nobody on the street when he passed at the relevant time." 3 witnesses, said Miss Marple. 3 descriptions. "And 1 prowler," said Raymond. "Presumably. Or none at all. Fog plays tricks." "It does," agreed Miss Marple, "though it is more commonly blamed for concealing what is there than for inventing what is not." Joyce frowned. "Should one warn Mrs. Carrington?" "If she's the house in question." "I imagine she's aware," said Raymond. "These things get around very quickly on streets of that kind. Everybody knows everybody's business through a 4-foot garden wall and a very well-informed parlour-maid." Miss Marple said, with a mildness that Raymond had learned to treat with respect, "I wonder whether anyone thought to write down the exact time at which each sighting took place?" Raymond looked at her. "I shouldn't think so." "Why?" "Oh, no particular reason. One does like things to be orderly." She counted stitches under her breath. "When was the fellow's woman's sighting?" "She didn't say precisely. Tuesday evening, I think." "And the tobacconist's boy?" "Wednesday, or possibly Tuesday. Jenkins was rather vague." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "People so often are, about time. It is the first thing one forgets and the last thing one thinks to record." Joyce had been watching her with the sharp, good-humored attention of a woman who'd been married to Raymond West for 6 years and had therefore had considerable practice in following conversations that appeared to be going in one direction and arrived somewhere entirely different. "You know," said Joyce, "you're doing it again." "Doing what, dear?" said Miss Marple. "Asking questions that don't sound like questions." Miss Marple smiled at her needles. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Raymond laughed and got up to pour himself a whiskey. The fog pressed against the windows. The room felt sealed, complete, the sort of room that makes the world outside feel distant and slightly unreal. Miss Marple lay awake for some time that night, listening to the particular silence of a London fog. No traffic, no footsteps, only the occasional muffled call of a river barge finding its way blind along the Thames. She thought about shadows. A shadow, properly considered, was not a thing in itself. It was produced by something else entirely, by the relationship between a solid object and a source of light. Move the lamp, and the shadow swung. Remove the object, and the shadow vanished. The shadow had no independent existence. It was evidence, not fact. 3 witnesses, 3 descriptions. Tall, slight, heavy-set. Dark overcoat, mackintosh, nothing at all. In St. Mary Mead, when the confusion had arisen about Mr. Hodgkins's shed, she had eventually established the truth by a simple method. She had asked each witness where they had been standing when they saw the figure. Mrs. Weatherby had been looking out of an upstairs window into lamplight. Mr. Simpkins had been walking with his back to the wind and his hat pulled forward. The Hartley girl had been standing directly under a gas lamp, which would have made any figure within 10 yards appear broader and more solid than it was. None of them had seen the same person. All of them were telling the truth after their fashion. She turned this over in her mind and arrived presently at a question that seemed to her considerably more interesting than the identity of the prowler. Who had first mentioned a prowler? It had come to Raymond through Jenkins at the Reform, who had heard from his wife, who knew someone on the street. A chain of that length passed through several links, gathered considerable inaccuracy. But somewhere at its origin, someone had first used the word. Someone had first pointed and said, "There is a shadow on Sloane Street." Miss Marple found this considerably more interesting than the shadow itself. She slept shortly after midnight. The fog, for its part, showed no inclination to disperse. It settled in the gutters and under the plane trees and against the polished brass knockers, conducting itself, as London fogs do, with an entirely comfortable disregard for the inconvenience of others. She mentioned none of this at breakfast. Raymond read his newspaper. Joyce ate toast and discussed, with some energy, whether they ought to go to a concert on Saturday. Miss Marple drank her tea and looked out at the embankment, now restored to visibility in the pale morning light, and thought that visibility was a rather misleading state of affairs. "Raymond," she said, when the toast was finished and Joyce had gone to telephone about the concert. "Yes?" He turned a page. "This person who first mentioned the prowler, Jenkins's wife's acquaintance on Sloane Street. Do you happen to know who that is?" Raymond looked up. He had the expression of a man who has just realized that a conversation he thought concluded has been continuing, in one person's mind, for the past 14 hours. "I could find out," he said. "I think it might be interesting if you did," said Miss Marple. She poured herself a second cup of tea and looked pleasantly out of the window, as though the matter were entirely trivial, and she had thought of it only just that moment. Raymond watched her for another few seconds, then put down his newspaper with the resigned air of a man who has learned, across many years, that when his aunt described something as interesting, it was almost invariably that, and rather more besides. Chapter 4. The Discovery. The telephone rang at 8:30 on a Friday morning while Miss Marple was eating her breakfast and Raymond was still in his dressing gown, reading a proof with the single-minded ferocity of a man who has found 2 errors on the first page. He picked it up with his free hand. His expression changed. Yes, she is. He held the receiver across the table without ceremony. "For you. A Miss Marsh. She sounds distressed." Miss Marple took it. "Evelyn." The voice on the line was compressed and slightly unsteady, as though the speaker had been rehearsing composure and found it less reliable than expected. "Miss Marple, I'm so sorry to disturb you. I asked the operator for Mr. Raymond West of Cheyne Walk. I remembered you had mentioned your nephew's name and the street." A brief pause. "Mrs. Carrington has been found this morning and she's dead." The breakfast room was very quiet. "I see," said Miss Marple. "Are you at Sloane Street now?" "Yes. The police are here. A Dr. Halliday came. He was called first. And then the police. Inspector Gryce." A pause in which something was swallowed. "She was in her armchair when I found her. I thought she had fallen asleep." "I shall come directly," said Miss Marple. She arrived at 42 Sloane Street at 9:10 to find the house in the subdued, particular disorder that violent death deposits on a domestic interior. 2 constables on the step, the door ajar, and the occupants gathered in the hall in varying degrees of distress, like birds disturbed from a nest but unable to fly. Evelyn Marsh sat on the hall chair nearest the wall, a handkerchief pressed against her mouth with both hands. She was perhaps 45, neat-featured and ordinarily composed, but grief or shock had stripped the composure away and what remained underneath looked raw. Ellen, the housemaid, stood 3 feet behind her, not touching her, not leaving her, maintaining the precise distance of someone who wishes to be useful but does not know how. At the drawing-room door, a uniformed constable stood with the implacable blankness of a man who has been told to let nobody through and intends to be accurate about it. Miss Marple crossed the hall, took Evelyn's hand briefly, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Tell me what happened." "I looked in at 11 last night." Evelyn's voice had regathered itself, if not entirely. "She was reading. I asked if she needed anything, and she said no. She seemed perfectly well." Her eyes moved towards the closed drawing-room door. "This morning she didn't come down at 8 as she always does. I knocked, and when there was no answer, I went in. She was in her armchair." "Were the French windows open?" Evelyn looked up. "Slightly, yes. I didn't think. It was cold, so I thought it odd, but I didn't think about the windows." "Of course not," said Miss Marple. A door to the left opened, and a man came out, carrying a small black bag and the air of someone who has rendered a professional verdict and considers the matter concluded. Dr. Halliday. He saw Miss Marple and paused. "I don't believe Miss Marple is a friend of the family," said Evelyn. "I see." He readjusted his bag from one hand to the other. "Well, a very distressing business. As I've told the inspector, Mrs. Carrington's heart, it was not strong. Whatever she may have said to others, I was very much aware of the risks. A shock of some kind in the night, and in her condition—" He shook his head. "The broken window suggests an intruder. The shock of that alone could have been sufficient." "Was there any sign of an intruder?" Miss Marple asked. "Other than the window?" "That's rather a question for the police." He moved towards the front door. "I'll send my report directly to Inspector Gryce." The door closed behind him. Miss Marple looked at Ellen, who had been listening to all of this with the focused attention of a girl who knows that what she hears now will be repeated for years. "Ellen," said Miss Marple, "was Mr. Adrian here yesterday evening?" Ellen blinked. "Yes, ma'am. He came about 7. Stayed for perhaps an hour, I should think, maybe a little longer." Was there anything particular about the visit?" "He came quite often, ma'am," said Ellen, which was not an answer, but was, Miss Marple noted, also not nothing. The inspector emerged from the drawing-room 10 minutes later. Gryce was a capable-looking man of 50, with a thick grey moustache and the unhurried manner of someone who has attended enough scenes of this kind to have ceased treating them as emergencies. He took Miss Marple's measure in a single professional glance and classified her, she knew, as an elderly acquaintance of the deceased, and therefore a minor element of the domestic backdrop. "I understand you knew Mrs. Carrington, ma'am?" "A long-standing acquaintance," said Miss Marple. "I called on her twice this week. She seemed quite well." Dr. Halliday's preliminary view is heart failure brought on by shock. He tucked his notebook under his arm. "There's been a prowler reported in the street. The French windows were not properly latched. It appears she disturbed someone in the night and, well, these things happen." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "Might I wonder, would it be very irregular? I should like to pay my respects, if that is permitted." The inspector considered her. The white hair, the neat gloves, the entirely non-threatening aspect. "The room is being examined," he said, "but I don't see any harm in a brief moment." He stood aside from the door. The drawing-room was unchanged from her previous visits, except in the way that all rooms change when the person who makes them purposeful is absent. The pale walls, the Persian carpet, the long French windows, all the same. The fire had not been lit this morning, and the cold came off the stone floor. Mrs. Lydia Carrington sat in her armchair by the fireplace. She was upright, as though she had simply ceased in the middle of an evening sitting, hands resting in her lap, and her head inclined only slightly. She wore her dressing gown. At her elbow, the small table held an empty cordial glass and a book left open at page 43. Beside the armchair, on the carpet, The silver-backed hand mirror lay in 3 pieces, the glass shattered outward. Miss Marple stood for a moment and looked. Not at the windows, though she noted them, standing slightly ajar, the latch in the retracted position. Not at the mirror, though she noted the distribution of the broken glass, all of it fallen outward from the frame rather than inward. Not at the cordial glass, though she noted it, empty and set upon the small tray on the side table rather than left beside the open book, where a woman reading alone would naturally place it. She looked at Mrs. Carrington's face. She had seen the faces of the dead before, quite a number of them over the years, in circumstances that had brought her to similar rooms for similar purposes. Fear left its mark on the features, a particular kind of slackness around the mouth and eyes, as though the muscles had unclenched all at once. She had seen it several times, and she knew it well. Mrs. Carrington's face held nothing of the kind. The features were still, composed, and about the eyes, this was what Miss Marple stood and considered for a full 10 seconds. There was something that was not peace and was not terror. It was a third thing. The particular expression of a woman who, in the last moment, had understood something completely. Inspector Gryce appeared at her shoulder. "Seen enough, Miss Marple," she said. "Yes, thank you, Inspector." She moved towards the door and paused, as though something had just occurred to her. "The cordial glass, will that be sent for analysis?" Gryce looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who expected a different sort of question. "Routine procedure, yes." "Good," said Miss Marple. She pulled on her gloves. "I only ask because there is a faint smell in the room that I cannot quite place. Perhaps you noticed it, above the perfume and the cold fireplace. Something sharp, rather clinical." She said it pleasantly, as one mentions a trifle. No doubt entirely explicable. She thanked the inspector, pressed Evelyn's hand at the door, and walked out into the pale October morning. The street was quiet. Polished brass knockers, immaculate steps, the plane trees standing stripped and thin in the cold air. Somewhere behind one of these composed facades, she thought, there was a person who had placed a body in a chair, opened a window and broken a mirror, and then walked out into the fog on a street where 3 different witnesses would all see something slightly different. The cordial glass had been placed on the tray, not left where she had been drinking. That was not the act of a stranger. Miss Marple walked to the end of Sloane Street and turned toward the bus stop, and her expression, had anyone been attending to it, was not the comfortable vagueness of an elderly lady paying her respects, but the quiet, settled gravity of a woman who has found the first corner piece of a puzzle and now knows the shape of the whole. Chapter 5. A pattern emerges. Grief, Miss Marple had observed over many years, expressed itself in a great variety of ways, some of them bearing very little resemblance to grief at all. She had known the bereaved to redecorate their sitting rooms, reorganize their larders, write long letters to acquaintances they disliked, and in one memorable case in St. Mary Mead, plant an entire orchard. Action was the great refuge from feeling. Evelyn Marsh, it turned out, made sandwiches. Miss Marple called on her the following afternoon at the small furnished room in Pimlico to which Evelyn had temporarily retreated, the Sloane Street house now sealed to its occupants by the requirements of the police. Evelyn answered the door with flowery hands and the slightly defiant expression of a woman who knows she is coping oddly but cannot quite stop. "I needed something to do," she said, leading the way to a cramped sitting room where an unlit gas fire and a small stack of detective novels from the lending library indicated a woman settling in for a solitary siege. "Very sensible," said Miss Marple. She accepted tea and declined the sandwiches, and waited while Evelyn settled into the only good chair with the cautious movements of someone still not certain of their own legs. "You were with Mrs. Carrington a long time," said Miss Marple. 9 years. Evelyn turned her cup in its saucer. She was not an easy woman, but she was a fair one. That is more than most people are. And Mr. Adrian, did you know him well? Something in the room shifted very slightly, the way air shifts before a window is opened. Well enough, said Evelyn. She set her cup down. He visited regularly, more so in the past few months. Were the visits always pleasant? Evelyn looked at Miss Marple with the careful attention of a woman deciding precisely how much to say. Mrs. Carrington had discovered some irregularities, she said at last, in the foundation accounts. I do not know the details. She did not tell me everything, but she had been going through papers very thoroughly for some weeks, and the last time Mr. Adrian came, about a fortnight ago, I heard raised voices. Did you hear what was said? She said. Evelyn paused. She said, "You have made me look a fool, Adrian, which I can forgive. You have taken what was not yours, which I cannot." The room was very still. Outside, a cart horse's hooves rang on the cobbles. "And his reply?" said Miss Marple. "I did not hear it. I moved away from the door." She said this with a composure that did not quite conceal the fact that she was aware it needed saying. The visit on the night she died, that was the first time he had been since. Miss Marple nodded. She looked at the gas fire. "The document on her desk when I visited," she said, apparently to herself. "The charity papers. She had mentioned the committee difficulty with Mrs. Lowe. But that was not the real difficulty, was it?" "No," said Evelyn quietly. "I don't believe it was." Colonel Brent took rather more finding. Miss Marple encountered him by a contrivance that had required only 2 telephone calls and a small deception regarding a message she wished to pass on from the Carrington solicitors at the corner of Lower Sloane Street the following morning. He was on his way somewhere and stopped with the mannerly reluctance of a man who finds himself unable not to. "A great loss," he said, "of Mrs. Carrington." His face arranged itself in sorrow, but below the arrangement his eyes were moving, cataloguing the street, the distance to the house, the position of the constable still stationed at the door of number 42. He had the eyes, Miss Marple thought, of a man perpetually reassessing his situation. "You were a great friend to her," said Miss Marple, "for 40 years. He said this with a weight that implied more than friendship, though he offered nothing further. She was fortunate to have someone so attentive. I noticed when I called. Your envelope on the table." "The Chamber's report," he said promptly. "Foundation business. She asked me to look into a few matters." He paused. "Administrative matters." "Of course." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "Had she spoken to you at all about any concerns? About the foundation?" A fraction of a second too long before he answered. "Nothing beyond the usual committee difficulties. Beatrice Lowe making a nuisance of herself over the allocation of funds." He straightened. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason at all," said Miss Marple. "I'm a foolish old woman and I ask too many questions. My nephew says so constantly." She smiled with great pleasantness. "It was the prowler, I think, that troubled me. You were not among those who saw him?" "I was not on the street that week." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Of course not." She bid him good morning and walked on, and did not look back, though she was fairly certain he stood watching her until she turned the corner. Dr. Halliday's consulting rooms were in Harley Street, and the thin excuse Miss Marple employed for her appointment, a vague complaint about her heart rhythm that had never troubled her in the slightest, cost her £0.50 and 40 minutes of an October afternoon. He was thorough, she conceded that. He listened to her heart with professional gravity and told her it was perfectly normal, which she already knew, and suggested she might be overexerting herself on stairs, which she might. "While I'm here," she said, accepting back her coat with the air of one who has just thought of something, "I wonder if I might ask about Mrs. Carrington. You attended her for some years." Halliday sat behind his desk. His pen rested between his fingers. "I did. She seemed to me quite well when I called on her last week, and yet I noticed she seemed troubled, preoccupied. In my experience, that kind of worry sits differently on the constitution than physical illness. Miss Marple paused with the thoughtful air of a woman pursuing a private concern. Had she spoken to you at all about her anxieties? About the foundation, for instance, or her stepson? He set down the pen. Mrs. Carrington's domestic affairs were not my province. No, of course not. I only ask because she struck me as a woman carrying something she had not shared with anyone. One does notice these things. She adjusted her gloves. Her stepson visited regularly, I understand. Was he a source of comfort to her, in your observation? A pause. Brief, but the kind of pause that arrives before a carefully managed answer. I couldn't say. I saw her professionally, Miss Marple, not socially. Quite so, she smiled. I suppose I'm simply an old woman who knew her slightly and finds it difficult to account for, well, these things are always a shock. He looked at her. She looked back with the clear, untroubled expression of a woman whose interest is entirely innocent. The inquest will establish the relevant facts, he said with a flatness that had required some effort to produce. Yes, said Miss Marple. I expect it will. She thanked him for his time and left. On the stairs, she paused and considered what she had seen in his face. Not guilt exactly, but the expression of a man who has constructed a careful version of events and has just felt the first faint vibration of doubt in its foundations. He knew something he had chosen not to weigh too carefully. That was a different thing from innocence, though it was also a different thing from murder. Adrian Carrington, Raymond had established through the mechanisms of the club and the reform and several other such institutions where information circulates under the guise of conversation, was staying at his usual set of rooms in Jermyn Street. He was not difficult to encounter. He was, Miss Marple gathered from Raymond's account of the encounter, a man of agreeable habits and a wide social circle, currently performing the public role of a bereaved stepson with considerable style. Raymond had described him, Sir 40, well-dressed, the kind of handsome that would last another 10 years if he took care of himself, and somewhat less if he did not. A facility for putting people at ease. A way of referring to his stepmother that suggested recent warmth without pressing the sentiment past credibility. He seemed very cut up, Raymond reported over dinner, though he held it well. Yes, said Miss Marple. I imagine he would. Raymond looked up from his wine-glass. You said that with rather a particular emphasis, Aunt Jane. Did I? She unfolded her napkin. I've been thinking about a young man I knew once in St. Mary Mead, a nephew visiting his widowed aunt. Very attentive, very personable. When she died, rather suddenly, he appeared at the funeral in the most becoming black coat and received condolences with tremendous grace. She smoothed the napkin across her lap. It was the accounts that gave him away eventually. He had been drawing on her charitable commitments for months, redirecting small amounts into a private account. Small enough, separately, that she had not noticed. Quite clever, really. But when one looked at them together, the shape became rather clear. Raymond set down his glass. The foundation accounts, he said. Raymond, said Miss Marple, I think it might be time for you to make some inquiries. Quietly, through your solicitor, perhaps, about the Carrington Foundation's recent records. She took a bread roll and broke it with the calm precision of a woman who has said exactly what she intended to say. There will be 2 dates on certain documents, I expect, one genuine and one rather newer than it ought to be. Raymond stared at her. You've known this since. I have suspected it, she corrected. There is a considerable distance between suspecting and knowing. That distance is precisely what the inquiry will cover. Outside, the evening had come in cold and clear, no fog tonight, the stars faint above the London rooftops. Miss Marple ate her dinner and said no more on the subject, and Raymond watched her with the expression he always wore at these moments. Half admiration, half the enduring mild astonishment of a man who has spent 30 years underestimating the same person. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The results of Raymond's enquiries arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered not by post but by Raymond himself, who appeared at breakfast with the expression of a man who has been reading documents until 2 a.m. and found them considerably more interesting than he expected. He set 3 sheets of paper on the table beside Miss Marple's boiled egg. Gifford, at the solicitor's, had already begun to look into things, he said, sitting down. It seems the Carrington Foundation accounts were rather more disordered than anyone had noticed. Gifford noticed them because he was preparing papers for probate. 2 donation records amended, the original amounts smaller than recorded, and the difference unaccounted for. A signature on a covenant document that Gifford considers inconsistent with Mrs. Carrington's other signatures. And 1 entry in the foundation ledger bearing a date in July of this year that was written, according to the handwriting examiner Gifford's partner consulted, with a pen charged with different ink than the entries surrounding it. Raymond paused. Added later, in other words, possibly considerably later. Miss Marple looked at the papers and did not touch them. Has Inspector Gryce been told? He's being told this morning. Gifford went directly to the station. Raymond sat back. You knew all this? I suspected the shape of it, said Miss Marple. Knowing is a different matter entirely. The cordial glass analysis came back yesterday as well, Raymond said. Gryce telephoned. He didn't say what it showed, but he asked whether you would be available to speak with him this afternoon. At Sloane Street. Then, said Miss Marple, I expect we had better go. Inspector Gryce met them at the door of number 42. Released that morning to the estate pending the inquest proceedings, a constable no longer stationed at the step, with the aspect of a man who has been required to substantially revise a position held with some confidence and is not yet accustomed to the new terrain. Miss Marple? He shook hands with the particular punctiliousness of a man acknowledging an obligation. I owe you some thanks for the suggestion regarding the glass. Oh, I am sure you would have thought of it quite soon yourself, said Miss Marple. Perhaps, said Gryce, which was rather more honest than might have been expected. The analysis confirmed the presence of potassium cyanide, enough to cause death without visible injury. Dr. Halliday's preliminary examination found no cause to suspect poisoning. The symptoms of cyanide poisoning in low doses can be consistent with cardiac failure. He looked at Miss Marple with an expression caught between professional displeasure and genuine curiosity. You knew this, I think, before the analysis. There was a smell, said Miss Marple. Bitter almonds. Very faint, because someone had opened the French windows to disperse it, and the night air had done its work. But faint is not the same as gone. And the windows? Opened from inside. The sill was dry, and it had been a damp night. Anyone entering from outside would have left some trace on the sill or the carpet beneath. There was none. She paused. Also, the mirror. Gryce nodded. You mentioned that. The glass had fallen outward from the frame rather than inward, as it would had someone struck it. It was dropped, or thrown downward. Someone standing over it, not someone striking it from across the room. She folded her hands in her lap. It was arranged to suggest a struggle that did not occur. Raymond, who had been listening with the concentrated attention of a man who writes novels and therefore attends carefully to the moment when a narrative turns, said, You knew it was Adrian from the beginning. I suspected, said Miss Marple again, with a small but definite emphasis. A suspicion requires something to confirm it before it becomes knowledge. The footsteps that stopped in the hall when Mrs. Carrington mentioned his visit, the briefcase with the worn monogram, the fact that he was described as visiting with papers. Papers, in my experience, are frequently the beginning of trouble when there is money involved and a person who trusts rather more than is wise. Gryce cleared his throat. Mr. Adrian Carrington has been asked to attend here at 3 o'clock this afternoon. In light of the documents and the analysis, I thought it most appropriate to speak with him in the presence of those who can provide context. He looked at Miss Marple with something approaching respect, which sat on him with the slight stiffness of a new coat. if you are willing to be present." "Quite willing," said Miss Marple. Adrian Carrington arrived at 3 o'clock precisely and walked into the drawing room of his stepmother's house with the unhurried ease of a man who has lived a life arranged around managing difficult situations and considers this one well within his competence. He was, as Raymond had described, well-dressed and well-composed. His grief was present but restrained, the correct amount, worn at the correct angle. His eyes moved once around the room. Miss Marple, Raymond, Gryce, the constable by the door, and made a rapid, invisible calculation. "Inspector," he said pleasantly, "I'm not sure I understand why this meeting requires quite such an assembly." "Sit down, Mr. Carrington," said Gryce. Adrian sat. He crossed one leg over the other with the deliberate leisure of a man establishing that he has nothing to hide because a man who has nothing to hide does not hurry. Gryce laid the documents on the table between them. He spoke for several minutes about the foundation accounts, the handwriting analysis, the dated entry. Adrian's expression held steady. Polite attention, slight perplexity, the reasonable frown of a man hearing an unexpected accusation. "I imagine," said Adrian, "there has been an administrative error of some kind. My stepmother's health had been poor, and the foundation records were not as carefully maintained this past year as they might have been." "The cordial glass," said Gryce, "contained potassium cyanide." A silence. It was not long, 3, perhaps 4 seconds, but it had a quality quite distinct from the silences that had preceded it. Adrian's composure did not shatter. It did something subtler and more revealing. It held on, very slightly past the moment when a man with nothing to fear would have spoken. "That is a very serious statement," Adrian said. "Yes," said Gryce. "It is." "I want to be clear," Adrian said, "that I visited my stepmother that evening, yes. We had a conversation. We had differences, which I had hoped to resolve." His voice was even, reasonable, the voice of a man constructing a structure as he spoke. "I left her in good health," Miss Marple said, gently and without particular emphasis. "Helen tells us you stayed approximately an hour." Adrian looked at her. It was, she thought, the first time he had looked at her with any actual attention. "An hour, perhaps slightly less." "And the documents on your stepmother's desk when you arrived," said Miss Marple. "The charity papers." She had discovered the irregularities, had she not? She had told you so, I believe, at an earlier visit. The structure Adrian had been constructing developed a visible crack. "I don't know what you've been told." "She told you," said Miss Marple, still with the same quiet pleasantness, "that you had taken what was not yours, and that she could not forgive it. Those were her words, I believe, or very close to them. She intended to remove you from her will and to expose what had been done to the foundation trustees." She looked at him without hardness, but without any softness either. The clear, undeceived gaze of a woman who has understood human nature from a very long acquaintance with it. She had discovered it entirely, had she not? The altered dates, the redirected funds, the forged signature. There was nothing left to conceal. Adrian said nothing. His mouth opened and closed once. "You came that evening under the pretense of reconciliation," said Miss Marple. "She received you because she was a fair woman and she would not condemn without hearing what you had to say. You put the cyanide in her cordial. You had the means and the opportunity, and a reason that had grown from financial necessity into simple desperation. You opened the French windows and broke the mirror. You had spent the preceding week making certain you were seen on the street. Seen in a coat, seen in a mackintosh, seen and not seen, so that a prowler might be suggested. A shadow that was really you, glimpsed deliberately, described differently by each person because you arranged to be seen differently each time." She paused. "When a shadow changes shape," she said, "it is usually because someone is moving the lamp." The room was entirely still. Adrian Carrington's composure, that careful, well-maintained edifice, did not fall all at once. It went the way of structures under sustained pressure. First the small movements, barely visible, a muscle in the jaw, a slight whitening about the mouth, and then the larger ones. His hands, which had been resting with studied ease on the chair arms, closed very slowly into fists. He looked at Miss Marple and said nothing. Then he looked at Gryce and said nothing again. His silences had begun as weapons and were ending as surrenders. Gryce stood. The constable moved. Raymond, from his position by the window, watched his aunt with an expression it would be unkind to call astonishment, but which was very nearly that. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and did not look at Adrian again. There was nothing unkind in this. It was simply that she had learned, over many years, that at the moment justice takes hold, an elderly lady's continued attention is neither required nor particularly helpful. She looked instead at the French windows, still slightly ajar, the garden beyond bare and cold and honest in the October light, and thought of a woman seated in an armchair who had, in her last moment, understood everything. That, at least, was a kind of completion. Epilogue. What remains? The newspapers, which had devoted a considerable number of column inches to the shadow over Sloane Street and its fog-wrapped prowler, found the resolution of the matter a good deal less picturesque than the mystery, and lost interest accordingly. A stepson and a poisoned cordial made for a reliable story, but it lacked atmosphere. There was no shadow in the end, only a man who had been rather clever and not quite clever enough, which is a story told tolerably often, and satisfies no one. Inspector Gryce filed his report. The handwriting examiner confirmed the forgeries. The Foundation's accounts were placed before the trustees, who received the news with the particular expression of people who have been deceived in someone and are, despite everything, more embarrassed than angry. Adrian Carrington said very little at any subsequent point that was worth recording. His solicitor said a great deal more, to very little effect. Evelyn Marsh accepted a position with a family in Wiltshire, a widow with 2 young children who required a firm, sensible companion and would, Miss Marple rather thought, be fortunate to have one. Colonel Brent sent a substantial arrangement of white chrysanthemums to the inquest, which was noted and thought appropriate. Dr. Halliday's name appeared in no subsequent proceedings. There was no evidence that he had known precisely what use was made of his prescriptions. And Miss Marple, when Raymond pressed the point, said only that a physician who tells a patient her heart is perfectly sound, while simultaneously prescribing tonics she does not require, is either confused or convenient, and that either way the General Medical Council would no doubt draw their own conclusions in time. She said this without particular venom. It was simply how things were. Miss Marple left London on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after her arrival, on the 10:47 from Paddington. Raymond carried her bag to the platform with the slightly overcompensatory attentiveness of a man who knows he has spent the past fortnight being surprised by the same person repeatedly, and feels this reflects, in some small measure, on his own perceptiveness. He said that she must come again in the spring. Miss Marple said that would be very pleasant, and meant it. Joyce kissed her cheek at the barrier and said, without any irony whatsoever, that London was considerably safer than Chelsea had been 2 weeks ago, and that this was, in her view, directly attributable to the presence of Aunt Jane. "Oh, I did very little," said Miss Marple. "The smell in the drawing-room really did all the important work." "The smell," said Joyce, "and 30 years of knowing things about people." Miss Marple considered this. 40, she said, and boarded the train. The carriage was quiet. Fields replaced the outskirts of the city gradually, the way decent behavior replaces bad habit. Slowly, without fanfare, the better thing asserting itself until the worse was simply no longer visible. Miss Marple folded her hands on her knitting bag and looked out of the window. She thought of Lydia Carrington, not as she had appeared in that drawing-room, settled in her armchair with the cold light coming through the ajar French windows, But as she had appeared on the morning of Miss Marple's first call, coming down the stairs with the unhurried grace of a woman who had never needed to hurry. Capable and kind, as Evelyn had said. Fair. That word had stayed with her. Not brilliant, not dramatic, but fair. In Miss Marple's experience, fair was considerably rarer and considerably more valuable than either. Raymond had asked her, on the platform, how she had known. She had told him, as she often did, with a story. There had been a young man in St. Mary Mead, not the nephew with the charitable funds, a different young man, years before him, who had appeared very solicitous at his guardian's funeral. Every gesture had been correct, every expression had been what an observer would hope to see, but he had stood at the graveside precisely where the light was best, and Miss Marple had understood, watching him, that a man who truly grieves does not arrange himself. He simply stands where he is. Adrian Carrington had sat in that drawing-room chair with his grief worn at exactly the right angle. That was where she had known. She had known it from the first, if she was candid with herself. From the footsteps in the hall, from the worn briefcase, from the way he had passed through without a greeting, as though the house were already his. But knowing was not enough on its own. Knowing required the courtesy of evidence. The train moved through Berkshire, past fields of pale winter grass, past villages where the smoke rose straight from chimneys in the still air. Miss Marple watched them pass, and thought, as she so often did, that human nature was very much the same wherever one found it, and that the distance between a London drawing-room and a village garden shed was, in the matters that counted, no distance at all. She picked up her knitting. Sloane Street would return, she knew, to its polished and particular calm. The brass knockers would be polished. The window boxes would be replanted in spring. In a year's time, someone else would live at number 42, and they would not know anything about it, which was perhaps for the best. The train ran on south and west towards St. Mary Mead and its quiet roads and its very considerable store of human drama, where things were always very much as they appeared, and very much not, in equal measure, and where Miss Marple would return to her garden and her knitting and her birds with the comfortable certainty of a woman who has once again seen a thing through to its proper end. The wool moved through her fingers. The fields went past. And the shadow over Sloane Street, that obliging shape-shifting thing, that shadow with no shape of its own, dissolved, as all such shadows do, in the plain light of a winter afternoon. The shadow that troubled Sloane Street proved to be no stranger in the fog, but a deception carefully arranged to hide a calculated crime. What began as whispers of a prowler ended as a lesson in patience, observation, and the quiet exposure of truth. If this mystery held your attention, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Until another volume is opened, remember, shadows rarely lie. Only the people who cast them do.